Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
And we're back with another SpyMaster interview celebrating the sound of 007 Cam. Who do we have joining us?
Yes, we are talking to Matt Whitecross, the director of the Sound of 007 documentary that was released on Amazon Prime to coincide with the 60th anniversary of James Bond.
Yeah, so I think without further ado, Cam, spin up that interview. And joining us now on the show, the director of the fantastic documentary The Sound of 007 is Mr. Matt Whitecross. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I had the unique privilege of being in the audience at the BFI when you screened it just ahead of time of its release, so I was one of the few who saw it early.
Thank you very much for coming. Yeah, it was a really fun night. It's weird when you work on anything. I mean, it must be the same for you guys as well, but you work on something and you're in a bit of a bubble, and particularly on documentaries. I think when I've done dramas, you can have anywhere up to 100 people working on it. But on documentaries, it tends to be quite a small core team. So there's only really 4 or 5 of us in a room, sometimes fewer, sometimes because of COVID, we end up in lockdown at home. And so that happened. I mean, we were really up against it to try and get to that deadline because we knew we had to be out for Bond Day and that was going to shift. And it was the 60th anniversary. The 60th anniversary wasn't going to shift. So we knew we had to somehow get it out, and which initially at the beginning felt like it was going to be fine. But then actually the film went through various different evolutions, and in a nice way, there were lots of people who all have a stake in it. You know, there's a lot of people for whom Bond is their baby, you know, not least obviously Barbara and Michael and Greg now, and then, but also MGM and also, Amazon in the end. So it was, it was a more protracted process than it's sometimes been in the past. And also just because it was such a tough nut to crack, because we had somehow in 90 minutes to tell 60 years worth of history. And it's a lot of characters and a lot of music and so on. So yeah, we only finished it about a week before you saw it. So it was a lovely night because we were sort of like, it's out, for better or worse, and whether people like it or hate it, it's done, and you can sit and enjoy it, and it is what it is. It's done.
Are you able to relax when you're sitting there at the premiere watching it with the audience, or are you still kind of in creative mode?
No, you can't relax. There's a kind of weird, I mean, for me anyway, there's a kind of weird high. Like you have this kind of simultaneous kind of gut-wrenching like knot in your stomach, but at the same time a buzz, because you can hear where it's working. You can definitely sense in an audience where, okay, this is actually, no, this is, they're getting it, or they like it, or you can definitely sense if there's any longers, and if there's any moments where it's, oh yeah, I kind of think we could have worked on that more. All of that, you definitely feel it. All your senses are heightened. I think I'm more relaxed in this day and age once you've got a few under your belt. In the early days, it was absolute agony, and you kind of have to leave and just sit at the back of the screening room and run in and out, and all you can see is the mistakes. And I think now I've learned with more, a little bit more experience, just you got to let it go. It's not yours anymore. You worked on it, you did everything you can, and for better or worse, you know the faults of it probably better than anyone else will ever know. There's normally a reason for them, and there's all kinds of reasons for why it works and why it doesn't work. And so you just, at that point, even if there's things in there that you would have done differently or you feel you could have got better, it's too late and it's out there, and you just enjoy it for what it is.
Well, it was interesting because after watching it at the BFI and coming home doing some sort of due diligence and sort of reading about it, I didn't know that you'd actually created, firstly, some music videos that I really love. The Flood, Take That video, I think is one of my favorites, actually.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's a wonderful song and a wonderful video, actually. It works really well, especially with the sort of relaunch of having the 5 back together. I thought it was a really nice touch, that
Thank
video.
You. No, that was a fun one to do. And I think with the music videos, I kind of more or less where I started out. And we kind of started out simultaneously with music videos and just starting as trying to make short films, and then also working initially as a runner, as an assistant, and then working my way up through editing and through second unit directing and so on. So yeah, the music videos is something I still do now. I nearly only do kind of almost exclusively just work with Coldplay now, just because I'm lucky enough to be able to do that. And but yeah, every so often the phone rings and it'll be a take that, or it'll be, you know, whoever, Liam Gallagher or someone, and you just go off and step into that world for a couple of days, which is amazing. It's wonderful.
And you've got the Rolling Stones under your belt as well. That's another
Got
one.
the Stones and the belt, yes, yeah, and it's funny because every single one of them is a completely unique experience from my point of view, even when it's with the same bands, because it's a different song and it's a different time and it's possibly a different, you know, era for them, different feel. And for me, it's like, you know, the least experienced person on any film set, just by the nature of these things, is the director. And so when you're doing a drama, and even when you're doing documentary, even if you're prolific, you're still like the camera person will be finishing one film on the Friday and doing another on the Monday. And so they might, you know, under their belt, they'll be doing music videos and doing commercials and doing everything and everything. So by the end of a year, they might have done 12 projects. Whereas if you're a prolific director, you might maybe do one a year, maybe one every 2 years. Some directors do one every 5 years. So you're having to lean on other people for their experience. And often, you know, a shoot might last 5 or 6 weeks. And you probably spend the first week just trying to remember how to do your job. So the more you can go off and do another music video or anything, go and shoot something in between, the easier, so the more relaxed you become on set. And also, you know, even if you have a long life and you have a long career, you just don't get to do everything. Like the chances are I'm never going to get to do a martial arts film. But if someone rings next week and says, have you got an idea for this music video? You're like, wow, we could do a Kung Fu story. Or, you know, we just got to do a Coldplay video with the Jim Henson Company, which is amazing. We did another one with them and these guys called The Imaginarium, which is Andy Serkis and his team. So using all the performance capture software and all the you know the setup that they use for Avatar and everything else. I mean, that's amazing. Like, you know, I wouldn't get to do that on a small indie film, and suddenly you're stepping onto that, and you've got a more borderline limitless budget, so you can just say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. And so that, you know, the music videos for me, aside from just being fun and also being, you know, there's less pressure for it to make sense. You don't have a lot of opinions, and especially when I'm working with Coldplay, it generally tends to be me and the band and Phil, who's their creative director, and that's it. And that's all the cooks you're going to have to deal with. So it's a bit like making an insanely expensive home video where you're just having fun. There's a bit of pressure, but there's still like you're just getting to try things out.
I was looking through the list of music videos before, and I think, like, in terms of Coldplay, Paradise is the one that really jumped out to me as one I definitely remember, because I outside of all this, I do a lot of music work, and it's like I look at music videos, and I think it's a bit of a lost art in ways. Like, from when I was younger, it was definitely a thing that was focused on, and there's still great work being done, much like yourself. But I think for a lot of people, it's sort of not as focused on anymore. Same with album art as well. But yeah, both great ones I pointed out there. But let's go back a wee bit and just talk about you getting into filmmaking in the first place before we get to sort of Bond and everything like that. What prompted you wanted to get into filmmaking at all?
Well, I probably the same motivations that a lot of filmmakers have, which is just it's like the most addictive and expensive drug in the world. And once it gets its hooks into you, whether as a viewer or as someone who, you know, you feel like you might want to do it for a living, it's very hard. You know, I think it's like any art form, you know, whether it's music or dance or whatever floats your boat. Once that thing gets into your head, it's just that it completely, especially at a young age and an impressionable age, it completely takes over. And so I remember as a kid just becoming completely obsessed and addicted to films at a very, very early age. And I think just, you know, because obviously it's one of those things that you're kind of captive audience as in when I was growing up. There wasn't much else to do growing up in Oxford, in the suburbs. You know, you just that's what we did. And so I'd hang out with friends or hang out with my parents or once you got into it later and later into the night, just watching more and more stuff. And it was really only, you know, you had to there was a kind of autodidact thing that you had to do because there wasn't the internet. And, you know, you learned by going to the library and finding books, and you would read in the paper, oh, there's a film called Touch of Evil. Sounds amazing. And then you might have to wait 3 years before you could actually get your hands on it and watch it late at night. And it would be at 1 a.m. and you'd have to stay up and tape it and you press record. So you really value it in a way that, you know, now that everything's accessible, somehow it becomes more disposable. And I don't know, you know, obviously I'm middle-aged now, but if I was getting into film now, in a weird way, the fact that everything is accessible means that maybe this is too busy and it's harder to try and make your own taste, and you don't discover things in quite the same way. So I just got the bug really early on. My dad was into kind of mixture of different films. He was into kind of, gangster movies like from the 40s and 50s. He loved Humphrey Bogart and Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, Robert Mitchum, those kinds of guys. So I watched all those films. My mum was more into kind of more art house stuff, but also musicals. So I'd watch a lot of those. It was a very eclectic mix. And then you start finding your own taste. And I guess at a certain point, probably when I was 10 or 11 or something, I started thinking, well, these things don't just exist. They happen. They happen to be, they don't just like land on this planet. They're created by people, but I had no idea how you would even go about that. And so you start reading books on it, because again, there's no DVD extras at that point. There's no DVDs. There's no way really of finding this stuff out. You can't go online and watch a behind the scenes video because that doesn't exist. There were amazing critics and filmmakers like Mark Cousins and Alex Walker used to present this thing called Movie Drone. And there was Moving Pictures as well, that was my film school, really. I would just watch those things. They'd have a scene by scene where Mark Cousins would get David Lynch, or he would get, Katharine Hepburn, or whoever it was that week. And they'd sit and they'd go through her movies, and you start to realize that these things are formed. There's these amazing creative forces behind them. And then it was like, well, yeah, but how the hell could I ever do that for a living? So I think initially you feel like, well, I can't do that. But somehow that you want to do that, and you're going to feel a little bit empty inside unless you get a chance to at least step into that world in any capacity. At that point I was like, look, I want to be a director, but I'm sure that's impossible. But maybe I could learn how to shoot, and I could be a camera person, or I could be an editor or something, or a runner or anything. I'll just do something on a film. And my dad bought like a home movie camera, just like a high 8 camera. And so me and my brother, we only had about 6 tapes. So we would go and shoot movies. And obviously there's no editing software. So we would have to, and I think this was quite a useful kind of limitation, was that if we wanted to shoot the film, we'd have to devise the film, figure out what the shots were, figure out what the dialogue was, and shoot it sequentially. And if we screwed up on any take, you'd have to rewind the tape and try and record it. And it was glitchy as hell and almost unwatchable in a lot of cases, but you figured out how to do it. You had to be very disciplined about it. And then there were a couple of film courses that were local where I went in, and they gave you a 16mm camera, and you learned how to use that over a weekend. And that was it. And then I was, at a certain point, there weren't really undergraduate courses that you could do at that point in England. And I was thinking, I just want to go out and I'll become a runner. But then a lot of people said, let's go to uni and study anything, study English if you love books and you love storytelling, and that's the same kind of thing. But maybe just get to enjoy that experience. And while I was there, probably the first or second person I met when I arrived in UCL in Hawes was Chris Martin, who went on to form a band. And the other 3 people I met ended up being in the band. So completely miraculously, I met those guys, and I was into music, and I'd hang out with them a lot and film them a lot and film a lot of other stuff. And then when I finished uni, I carried on making short films, and I shot music videos with them. But this was before they even got signed, just us having fun and shooting things in the streets. And then I got a job, and my first proper job in the film industry was as a runner for Michael Winterbottom. And it was kind of a miracle, because he was my favorite British filmmaker. And I heard this job was going, and I turned up, and I didn't get the job. So they gave it to someone else. And then I went on holiday, and they rang me day 2 and were like, listen, this guy's useless, or he's quit, or something happened. You got to come back. So I think there's an element of luck, and there's an element of determination. I was like, I could have just said, no, I'm sorry, I'm on holiday. But obviously I'd caught the next flight back and started making cups of tea for famous people. But the great thing about Michael and the way that his philosophy, and I think Andrew Eaton, who was his producer at the time, they had this company called Revolution, and their thing was like, look, anyone can go out and do it. You can, you're here. There's only 5 of us under one roof. What can you, say day 2, he walked into the office and was like, okay, introduced himself, said, who are you? What do you want to do? I was like, I want to be a director. I want to be, he was like, okay, but what can you do? I was like, I can do anything. I do whatever you want. I can shoot, I can cut, I can write, he was like, okay, fine. And then I just carried on at that stage, sending faxes and printing scripts and doing that for about 9 months. And then he'd obviously clocked it, because they were doing, so on 24-hour Party People, they needed someone to come and shoot second unit. And so he was like, oh, you know how to shoot? Okay, we can come in. So it was me and the other runner effectively running around doing second unit. So we shot a lot of the stuff, ended up in the film. And then he was like, well, we don't have any money to pay for someone to do the trailer. You'll do the trailers. And I ended up editing it. And it just carried on from there. And that was my film school. And then I worked on the next film he did. We traveled to the border of Afghanistan and traveled all the way back with these guys playing refugees. And then after that, I carried on making my shorts. And then Michael came back to me at one point because I had this idea that I wanted to do a film about these guys who'd just been released from Guantanamo. And I was editing for Michael at that point. And he said, well, why don't we do it together? And it was amazing. Again, this is one of the top directors on the planet saying to the person who was a runner a couple of years before, do you want to direct a film with me? Which still to this day I still can't quite compute. But, he stuck to it. I think that's testament to who he is and his generosity. And he went off and was shooting a film with Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon, Cock and Bull Story, while I was prepping on Road to Guantanamo. And then we went off and shot it, and it got a lot of attention and meant that I got an agent. And then off the back of the agent, then I wrote a bunch of scripts. No one was even vaguely interested. They were pretty dark and very political and very uncommercial. One was set in London, and it was that era when there were a lot of those kind of triptych films, or those films where you had a lot of different, casts. So like Amores Perros or like Magnolia. And it was kind of like that with all this, like 8 different casts all around London, around the time of a London bombing. And they're all connected. They're all there on the scene. They're all affected in different ways. And then a few months after, it looked like it was looking quite positive to see if we could get some money. And then the actual London bombing happened. So like, oh shit, we definitely can't do that. And then I was writing another one, which was about the war in Iraq. And it again was pretty heavy. And everyone was saying, it's too soon, it's too soon. And then about a week later, it was, after one weekend, it was like, no, it's too late. There's a bunch of Hollywood films been made. So there was obviously a sweet spot of a weekend when it was probably doable. And so I with my agent, she just said, look, you're sitting at home with your scripts and your integrity, which is great, but you need to eat and you need to learn how to be on a film set. So I just went off and did a couple of jobs just to kind of learn. I did a couple of jobs with the company Kudos. There was like a spook spin-off and another thing, like a kids thing where I did, just went off and shot on a set with like big crew, like great actors. And even though it wasn't my thing, and I think for me as a slightly, kind of pushy, maybe a bit arrogant young director, I said, no, it's got to be just my thing. But actually it was invaluable because suddenly it was like, you're on a set, you've got to make the day. It's someone else's thing. So you're coming and trying to make it the best that it can be, but it's not you. So having to deal with all that, and you've got 40 crew instead of when I was working with Michael, there was, on In This World or on Road to Guantanamo, there was like 6 people on set, and suddenly there's 40 people on set and they're all looking at you, and you've got 6 minutes to try and get 3 shots at the end of the day, and you got to do it, and they'll pull the plug. I'd never had that experience before because on Michael's films we were all like families. So if we didn't get the shot by 7 o'clock, then we just carry on till we got it by 2 a.m. But you can't do that to a kind of jobbing, more traditional film crew. It's not fair. So yeah, so that was it, and then one thing led to the next.
So sort of like running concurrently with that, and maybe going back to your childhood as well. I mean, was there an interest in Bond? You mentioned like your family's influence with films. Was that something you liked as a kid, or is it something you found as an adult? What's your sort of relationship with James Bond?
I think probably like most people, especially in this country, but now internationally, I grew up with Bond. So it's, for me, it's all these stories are almost like folk tales, and the music is almost like the national anthem or like nursery rhymes. It's like, I can't even remember a time before Bond. So whether it's sitting down and watching the films, I don't know which one it would have been. I mean, it would have almost certainly have been, like a bank holiday. It would have been around Christmas time or Easter, and the entire family sitting around, and probably the extended family, my uncle and our cousins sitting down specifically to watch the Bond film. And I assume it probably would have been one of the Roger Moore ones. And then the music is even before that. It's so funny. It didn't really occur to me. And I remember talking to Barbara about this, that, I was saying, it's funny now having 3 young kids and obviously reading stories to them. And my parents used to do this thing at the end of, when you sit there and you're reading them to them for what's supposed to be 10 minutes, it becomes 20 minutes, it becomes half an hour. At a certain point, you've got to go, no, lights off, to be continued. And they would do this sound at the end of a chapter. They kind of go, da 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 da, which at the time I was like, oh, they're just doing the funny to be continued noise. And then it wasn't till actually I was talking to Barbara, it was like I've been, and I started doing it to my kids. I was like, I'm singing them the Bond theme. So from birth, that's been in my life, probably the same as it is for everyone else. And so I was always a fan. If it's funny because I went through a phase of, I think, the funny thing is the Bond films stay the same, but you change.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are different periods where different songs and different Bond films work for you and become really important to you, and other times when they don't work for you. The films and this music is the same, but somehow you've changed. And I find that for film and music in general, if we were to talk about my favorite film, it's very different to my favorite film when I was 10 or 20. And so I think I loved James Bond. I loved big mainstream cinema. I loved Back to the Future. I loved Jaws. I loved Star Wars, all those films growing up, as most people do. Then as I discovered more cinema and more indie cinema and more art house cinema, more films that are harder, that are kind of deliberately more challenging, less entertaining in an obvious way. Then I probably distanced myself. So I think for me, growing up, it was Roger Moore. I loved Roger Moore. Roger Moore was funny and quirky and just like and suave and all those things. He was just like, he was the perfect Bond. And my dad, when we would watch a Sean Connery film, he'd be like, he's this it's Sean Connery. Like, Sean Connery is Bond. Roger Moore's, who's this imposter? And for me, I was like, no, Sean Connery's scary. He's like, he's dangerous. He doesn't treat, he's not nice. And then obviously later on, you start to go, well, maybe that's good, or maybe that's closer to what a secret agent would be. And similarly, then with Timothy Dalton and with George Lazenby and all these different people that you discover later on. So I think I moved away from Bond for a while, and I moved away from any kind of mainstream entertainment because I needed to. And the same thing with music. I couldn't like music that other people liked because I was a pretentious little shit. As soon as something became popular, I had to move away. I had to be the first person to discover music, and then I had to be the first person to say that those people had sold out, whatever. I mean, I grew up in Oxford, so I got to see Radiohead and Supergrass and Ride and a lot of those Oxford bands when there was 30 people in the audience. But then, and I'd have the mixtapes and the demo tapes and all that kind of stuff. But then once they started becoming successful, I even though I love the music, I was like, yeah, it's okay, but you should have been there at the beginning. And I think it might have been the same with Bond, that I needed to kind of rediscover it later on. The great thing is that you can rediscover it because it's constantly, appearing and evolving. So then the first Bond film I saw in the cinema was definitely Living Daylights. And I remember coming out and loving the music and going out to go and buy the Aha single and playing it a lot. And then, I think probably around the time of Pierce Brosnan, I loved GoldenEye, but then I think I just started moving away and feeling like, this is big commercial cinema. And I don't think that's a problem really with the films, because when I go back and watch them, they're very entertaining. But I think it was just a period in my life where I was like, no, I'm going to go and I'm going to watch hard films that are difficult to like and difficult. And I need to kind of watch 100 times to understand. Even then, I'm not going to understand. And then I think now that when I was in my 30s and 40s, I think I went back to that. I gravitated back to that kind of stuff. And certainly when Daniel Craig became Bond, then I fell in love with that. And I think it's kind of the perfect blend of it's a kind of mature, but it's still very entertaining. It's dark, but it's still thrilling, all those kind of things. So it was kind of tailor-made for someone who loves entertainment, but feels a little bit guilty about it and feels like they need to be punished a bit and watch something that's, like with Craig, he doesn't enjoy his job, and he gets progressively more and more screwed up as a result of it, which struck me as a truer version of what it must be like to be involved in MI6.
So when you were, watching those Bond films when you were young and continuing on, like, when I look at your filmography, there's so much tied to music. And obviously that's such a big part of Bond. Did you really look at those movies with like a musical eye in those days? Or was it kind of like a secondary thing that it wasn't really till later you would really reflect on?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think I did eventually really get into the music. So I think particularly with Bond, the music is so front and center. Certainly the songs. So there's no way you can avoid the songs, and the songs are, you have the equivalent of a kind of MTV music video before MTV at the beginning. So I would definitely know those songs. So that you can't ignore that. That demands to be heard and noticed. And everyone has their favorites and the ones they think work less well and all that kind of stuff. With the music, as soon as I started getting into films, I discovered John Barry, I think through Bond, and became obsessed with him and collected a lot of the LPs and went back. And the more obscure the film, the better. And the music is uniformly brilliant as well. He doesn't really, he doesn't phone it in for smaller films. So there's, even though I think, I liked a lot of his scores for films that I still probably to date haven't actually seen, but just loved the music for them. And then went back into the John Barry 7 and listened to that stuff. So yeah, I got into that music through Bond. But the scores in general, I don't think I would have gone and really explored his scores for Bond. It was the other stuff he did. I think I got into it that way. And that was more of a process through this film. Because although, of course, like everyone, I knew and loved the songs he'd done for Bond. And I knew the great job he'd done with the theme. And I knew there's certain ones where I think I had a couple of the soundtracks. I probably had On Her Majesty's Secret Service somewhere. And I don't know which other one I would have had. Yeah, probably The Living Daylights, just because it was an important one for me. But I didn't know them inside out. And it was not until, coming back to this film. I think I really enjoyed what David did with, particularly with Casino Royale. So I think I went out and bought that soundtrack after watching the film. But I wasn't a kind of Bond nerd. I don't have any Bond tattoos or anything like that. So it was more that came as a result of the research on this.
Well, it's interesting looking at this and sort of discussing your career leading up to the point of the documentary, because as Cam sort of said, there's so many parallel lines here. You've got documentary making, you've done, I actually have seen already the Supersonic one with Oasis. You also got the Coldplay one, Head Full of Dreams, as well. All building to this point, plus seeing the Bond films growing up and a love of music. And it culminates in you doing The Sound of 007. I think it's probably the perfect sort of the recipe of everything you've done so far. So I suppose the first question when it comes to Sound of 007 is, how did that opportunity come your way?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, I don't know if I was necessarily the obvious choice, only in the sense that, for them, I'm sure they had plenty of people they could have gone to. It was more to do with Barbara's relationship with John Batzik, who's the producer. And they made the Everything or Nothing Bond documentary together about 10 years ago. And so I'd met John a few times through the years. I mean, it's funny because I'd always considered myself a drama director, but I happened to drop in to do a couple of documentaries along the way, which I loved. And then it got to a point when I'd done enough of them. I was like, oh, this is great. I was alternating at one point, doing one documentary, one drama. And then after I got to a point where I'd been offered a couple of bigger projects, which just as we were starting our family, and they were going to take me away from the family for a long time, and then Supersonic just kind of landed on my lap. So it was not really a kind of conscious move. I don't think I've never planned a career as such, which is pretty obvious if you look at the things I've done, because there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it particularly, other than trying not to repeat yourself too much or just find something else, embracing a new opportunity. And so I talked to John Batzik, who's a great documentary producer, and he did Searching for Sugarman, and he did The Rescue recently, and One Day in September. He's an amazing producer. And we talked a lot about different potential projects. As I was doing more documentaries, a few documentary producers kind of came to me and said, look, let's start talking about what we could do. And two of them came close to happening that didn't happen. And then we were prepping on this Paralympics documentary, which hasn't come out yet. But he just rang me up one day and said, look, would you be interested in going to meet Barbara and Michael, the Bond producers, and just have a chat with them? They've got an idea that they've got to have this anniversary, but they're not really sure how they want to commemorate it. And they thought maybe a documentary is the way to go. And I was like, well, I don't know if I'm the right person to do it. But on the other hand, obviously, I'd love to meet them, for the reasons that we were saying. It's like I love those films, but there are other people out there who know them inside out, who are obsessed with them. Whereas I just love them as a fan, but it's not like I don't have any Bond posters on my wall. I don't know the dialogue inside out, and I have friends who can recite. If you got them, start them off with Dr. No, they could probably just sit there in real time and recite the dialogue and hum the cues. Yeah, that's that. I don't have that level of nerdiness. But anyway, so I was like, no, of course I'd love to go and meet them anyway. And so we went into Eon, which is over in Piccadilly, and over in Mayfair, and we met up, and it was just before Christmas. And I think I'd read obviously that they were going through all this stuff, that Danny Boyle had been on, and then Carey had come on board. So they had very big fish to fry at that point, and they were about to go off and start shooting, I think, or prepping. So this was, it just goes to show how their minds work, how they plan months, years in advance for the next thing and the next thing, because they have to. And we sat down and we had a bit of a brainstorm, and it was great because They're very down to earth. They're very approachable. You just don't know stepping into that world what they're going to be like. They have very good reputations, universally, and you speak to anyone about them, and everyone speaks very highly of them. Not only kind of their intelligence, but they're very warm. People talk about the Eon family, and it really does feel like a family business. You go in there and you meet everyone, and everyone works, and they're in and out of each other's pockets. And people come in and work a lot as part of the same team. So we kind of brainstormed a few ideas. They said they had this anniversary coming up in a couple of years, and that was it. And then, as we were walking out, they had these big Technic Lego Aston Martins piled up, and said, "Oh, just take a couple of those for your kids." So that was it. So I was like, "Well, look, if we never hear back from them, then it was a very nice day, and we got to hang out and go and have tea with Barbara and Michael." And then we just didn't hear back for over a year. And so, obviously they went off and shot the film, and I in my mind, it's like, well, they just gave it to a better director or whatever, the usual thing. It's not like you don't always get the gigs you go in for. But then I got a call from John one day, and we were in one of the many lockdowns, just saying, listen, I just got a call from Barbara saying, look, what's going on? When are we making this film? Which was great. But also at that point, I then had 2 other projects potentially lined up. So I was like, well, how am I going to juggle all these things? But the difference between working with Eon and working with most other people is just that they make things happen. So, the protracted process of getting most films made, I mean, less so with documentaries. Documentaries are easier because they're smaller and they tend to happen quicker. But which is the other joy of making them compared to dramas, where I've been working on a couple of dramas for 10 years and we're still not on set. So you have that kind of timeline. But this was like, got on the phone to Barbara. Barbara's like, yeah, look, we want to make something of the different ideas we floated. They had actually proposed doing something on the music, and they were like, that's the one we want to go for. I was like, great. I've got these other things coming. Yeah, okay, fine. Well, let's just get on the phone. We're going to pitch it. We got on the phone. At that stage, it was Apple. On the phone to Apple, you do one of those Zooms where it's like 40 people on the call. I kind of said, well, look, I think it could be kind of like this, and more or less pitched the what we've ended up making. And in the end, they're like, okay, it sounds great. Oh yeah, brilliant. All right, well, perfect. We'll speak soon. And then about an hour later, Barbara's like, yeah, we got the money. That was it. I mean, it's just unheard of. So then the next day I was like, oh, right, well, I guess we're making it. And these other films have to wait. And it happened very quickly. But then the next part is, okay, well, look, the challenge, as we started off by saying today, is that how do you squeeze 60 years into 90 minutes? Because everyone was pretty upfront that we want this to be a one-off, and we want it to be ready by next year. And it can't be a minute over 90 minutes because that's what we feel is right. We want it to be a kind of short and sweet, punchy thing. So you can't do it. You can't cover every song, and you can't probably do it chronologically. And I was like, okay, well, maybe that makes it more interesting. It's going to lead people back to the music, maybe make people reassess the scores of those films, but it can't possibly be a kind of, go through and nuts and bolts every single last detail, even though the original cuts obviously did. So we started off by just going to speak to as many people as possible, read all the books, watched all the documentaries, got all the archive in, listened to the music a lot. And then it was like, okay, well, we started off by doing it more or less sequentially and just covering every single song and every subject, from the idea that, the opening titles, because obviously that's 50% of what you're watching when you're listening to the song in the film. They kind of created the music video, arguably, and they were MTV before MTV, even to the point with Sheena Easton, who we interviewed. We had a whole section on everyone from Maurice Binder all the way to Daniel when he makes the new ones. So we did all of those things, and it was great. And then then you realize that it can only be 90 minutes, and you cut 3 hours out of it, and that's what you're left with.
Well, do you think that, you say you weren't like a Bond obsessive? Does that actually give you a better ability to, in some ways, oversee a project like this? Because if you hand the same kind of material to someone who is just a diehard Bond fan, they are going to want to make the Ken Burns Bond documentary, right?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument for that. I mean, it's happened on other films. So, for example, we ended up making a film called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll a couple of years after Road to Guantanamo, and I kept on saying no because I was like, look, my dad was an Ian Jury fan, but I just only know a couple of the songs. He used to play Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick, and Reason to Be Cheerful around the house. So I knew the songs and I knew the lyrics. But I was like, I don't know anything about this guy. And the producer, Damien Jones, was just like, no, that's why we want you to do it, because we don't want someone who is going to do a reverent version. It should be now looking, and I guess maybe there's an element of that when you're coming into projects. You have to kind of go to Bond boot camp. And similarly, we'd just done the year before, we'd done a documentary about the Kings, the Four Kings boxing. Now, boxing, I've seen quite a few fights, but I'm not, again, I've only been to a couple of fights. I have very mixed feelings about boxing in general. The idea of generally of poor people having to fight each other for the entertainment of the masses, it just kind of leaves, and there aren't many happy boxing stories. So I came into it with complicated feelings, but again, the producers on that, James Gay Reese and Paul Martin, were like, no, that's why we want you to do it, because we don't want to do just the kind of the obvious boxing front and center. We want to do a political film that happens to have boxing in it. And that's what got me excited about that. So each time I think I've ended up learning a lot on the jobs. I don't, with the exception of probably Coldplay, because I've grown up with them. I don't think there's ever been a film that I've worked on dramas or other. Oh, and Ashes, I did a film called Ashes, which is about a man with Alzheimer's, and my dad had Alzheimer's at the time. But other than that, most of the projects I've done, that I've been hired to do, the more I've written them myself, have been about subjects that I don't know that much about initially.
So, obviously you've been set this task by the powers that be, Barbara and Michael, and it's got to be 90 minutes. That's your cutoff. Fine. When you got started, obviously you said you sort of went through sequentially. That makes sense. What was your goal with the documentary? What story did you sort of want to tell with it?
Well, it's a great question. And I think that's the question that we kept on asking ourselves throughout, and we kept on coming up with different answers. So initially, my feeling was like, well, first of all, let's just celebrate the music. Obviously, that's the primary reason. I think music is obviously essential to film in general, but particularly so, I think, with Bond, and particularly if you take all the big blockbuster series that people know and love, everything from Harry Potter to Star Wars to Bond. For me, it's Bond that it's the most essential for, and it's the most unique in the sense that you can't really separate it from the films. I think if we look at Dr. No, for example, as we went back and rewatched it, I was like, that opening scene on Connery, why is it so iconic? Well, it's not because of Connery, because Connery doesn't turn up to the end of that scene. You're tracking in on the back of someone. You're cutting to people around the casino. Why is it exciting? Why is it sexy? Why is it edgy? It's because of that theme. We don't know it, and then you see him, and that's the climax. But that's only when the thing begins to kick in. Before then, it's for me it's, and then similarly throughout, the fact that it evolves. Whereas the music, as iconic as all those John Williams scores are for Raiders of the Lost Ark and so on, when the new indie film comes out, it's going to have the same score. It's not going to have a modern score. It has to be nostalgic. But Bond evolves, and it evolves through all these different kind of phases, everything from swing music and lounge music to rock and roll to techno to to Hans Zimmer and the kind of whatever you want to call that kind of insular stripped down thing that Billy and Phineas do in terms of the songs. So it kind of evolves and it reflects the modern era, because Bond is set in modern times always. It's always set in the present day, but it reflects it through this kind of whatever the quality that is Bond. So it's very, very interesting from a documentary perspective in a way that other music is harder to talk about, because then you start getting quite nerdy. Whereas I think you can actually talk about Bond in a more interesting and accessible way, because it's so unique and there's so much to talk about. So yeah, as far as the story went, so we started off by going, well, look, we want to celebrate the music, but then how do we give this kind of shape and structure? Then I kind of started thinking, let's do the research and just get everything in, and maybe it'll present itself. But in the meantime, the initial approach was we'll tell the story of John Barry, and that'll be our overarching spine, because he did most of them, and he kind of invented the Bond sound. So we'll start with him, then we'll back off from him, and we can hop around, but then we'll say goodbye to him, because around the time of The Living Daylights, that was his swan song, and he even appears in the film. And so we had Mariam Darbo and John Glenn and other people talking about how he'd become disillusioned and felt like he had nothing new to say. And then we went into a whole extra bit about his future career. We went into, specifically into films like Out of Africa and Dances with Wolves, and told that part of the story. Then we went all the way back to his childhood and his tricky relationship with his father, and his father who owned a string of cinemas, where they also used to perform music. But he really treated his son, he treated John very badly. And there was this kind of melancholy at the heart of him that creates this amazing music. So it's a kind of perfect storm of all these elements that creates the John Barry sound, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, we had all that in. And then we would dip in and out of Bond films. And because of obviously the fact that Hans Zimmer and David Arnold were so influenced by John Barry, they had to be. So therefore we could use that as a way into the later films as well. And we had a whole section on how David was passed the baton by John specifically, and we had footage of that and so on. So all of that was great. But at a certain point when we started getting feedback, people were like, look, you're really making a John Barry documentary. You've only got 90 minutes and you're spending far too much time on him, which is, completely fair enough. And that's why at its best, I think that's why it's a collaborative thing. And I definitely felt coming into this that Barbara and Michael, specifically, and MGM, this is their baby. It's not mine. I'm coming in to try and tell the story, but they're the ones who really know their stuff. So they were very good on that. They're very supportive. And we ended up starting with some of that stuff, showing them pieces. And then we also had these kind of masterclass bits where it was like David Arnold explaining how he did Casino Royale, Hans Zimmer explaining how he and Steve Mazzaro wrote the end of No Time to Die. So all those bits, which for me, being a music nerd, were complete heaven. But at a certain point, I was thinking, is this too much? Maybe it's an added element too many. But what was great is the first time that Barbara and Michael came into the edit, they sat down with us, and there was a big pause after we showed them it, which I'd only cut, over a few hours the night before, just sitting there trying to put something together for them to look at. And then at the end, they both said, look, that's the best bit. You need to do more of that, which was great for me because I assumed they'd say, listen, general public are not interested in this kind of stuff in that level of detail. So then we had to kind of think of something new, and then I had this thought that maybe we should bring in a new artist to try and write us a Bond song, and that could be the thread. And we shot some stuff on that, but again, people were like, "Look, you don't have that much screen time. You can't get all the Bond songs in. You're going to bring in a new Bond song. It's like something's got to give." But then I think the more time we spent with Hans, and then getting to talk to Daniel Craig and Barbara and Michael, the more it felt like No Time to Die is certainly like a kind of bookend in Bond. It's the end of the Daniel Craig era. And luckily for us, I think that Hans Zimmer and Steve went back and they kind of brought in every single element they could find in all of John's music and went through the history of Bond music and really threw all of that at the score. So we then ended up using that really mostly as a kind of, that was the spine of the film. And then we could dip back in the past that way because we knew we couldn't just be purely chronological. But yeah, that was the tricky thing. It was not an easy brief. And on documentaries, I'm more used to just kind of going off and just finishing it, and then people have comments at the end. And it wasn't like that on this, but that was fine. I kind of knew it would be like that. And it's with Barbara and Michael, you have this kind of hive brain, along with Greg, along with all the people over there, Stephanie and Sam, where they know this stuff better than you ever will. They've lived it, it's their lives. So you get to kind of dip into that from time to time. And then they open up their archive to us. And, there's more footage there than almost more than we had time to watch. So we were still finding new tapes even towards the end. So that partly dictated the kind of stuff we showed and didn't show. And if we felt there was too much repetition, that was something else. The Duran Duran story is funny. And then we had a whole aha section about, like, you thought we had it bad with Duran Duran. They kind of came to a kind of grudging, mutual kind of respect, even to the point where they went over to go and visit John in the States. That was lovely. And that kind of bookended it. And then aha came in, and then he really got the hump and had enough. And then there was people were like, listen, didn't we just do this story? He started calling them the Hitler Youth, and, they would refuse to come to the studio and all this, which I was like, oh, this is great stuff. But actually, with a limited time, if it was an Apple miniseries and we had 10 hours, then maybe, but I think we just couldn't really warrant it. And so, I had to kind of apologize to all the people where we didn't include their favorite song or we didn't include a favorite moment, but something had to give. All I can say is that all those songs and all those scores were definitely in there at some point, but just didn't make the final cut.
Well, I'm curious, because obviously there's ones like, Sheena Easton, for example. You don't really talk about the For Your Eyes Only song or Man with the Golden Gun song. But for Bond fans, they want to hear all of this covered. But I also understand trying to weigh the demands of a general audience, because ultimately Bond is popular because of the general audience. They're the ones who all go out to the theater. It's, the diehards are in the small number of the fandom. So I'm really curious, when you're looking at the film now, we all know, stuff that was maybe not in the movie, but what was the toughest cuts? The ones that really kept you up at night?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think Well, yeah, for me, I was finding it hard to cut the John Barry stuff out because I felt like that was our through line, and that's what gave it
Mm.
emotional weight for me. But I take the point that it's not a John Barry documentary. I'm sure someone will make a great John Barry documentary, but that's not what we were told to make. So there was a limit to how much. We cut out some really lovely stuff. I really loved all the masterclass stuff that we had in there. So we had David Arnold take apart all of the Casino Royale theme and the soundtrack, and bit by bit explain how do you create a new Bond when Bond's whole persona has been in the previous iteration was Pierce Brosnan, where he's having fun. He's a great, he has moments. Obviously, there's some dark moments in a couple of the films, but ultimately he's someone who kind of moves on. It's episodic. He finishes one, it's like a sitcom. The next one, it's like he's doing something new. Whereas with Craig, it might not have evolved this. It kind of evolved organically. I don't think they planned in Casino Royale at the beginning to carry on and have the same story, but that's what happened. And so, how do you create a score that can reflect someone who's a kind of more realistic Bond, who's more damaged, who kills people for a living and doesn't enjoy it? He hates it because it's horrible. It's chipping away at his soul each time he does it. And so he said, well, you can't really give Bond an emotional theme. We know what the Bond theme is. It doesn't really do emotion. So he created this Vesper theme, which had these two interweaving ideas in it. One is kind of Vesper, and the other one is, in his mind, was kind of Daniel coming up to kind of help her, and these two things kind of connected as a romantic theme. And then that's been used in subsequent films as well, even all the way up to No Time to Die. So I loved all that stuff. But again, I think we were getting notes back to saying, listen, you're doing a lot on Daniel. And same for when we had a whole section on Chris Cornell. It's like, look, something's got to give, because otherwise you've got like 60% of this film is just Daniel, which is great, but it's, that's not Bond. And similarly, I'm trying to think of other things. I mean, one thing that Barbara said to me early on, which I loved, was she was talking about why music is particularly important with Bond, is that he's not someone who can emote. He conceals for a living, and that's the nature of his character and his job. So the music has to do all that and has to tell you what's going on. And it's so true. And that for me is why, I love these films, because they're doing the same thing that Sergio Leone did with Ennio Morricone in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and all those spaghetti westerns. Was just that, Clint Eastwood walks into a room, he doesn't say anything, so the music is having to do everything. And I think particularly that's the case with Bond. So we had those we had a section where we started to get into kind of Hitchcock and how music works in cinema in general, but again, it's just not enough space for it. We also had another great section I loved, which I kind of worked on just by myself because I was really enjoying it, was this idea of, can you argue that Bond created the music video? And then we interviewed Sheena Easton, and we had loads of great Maurice Binder footage of him on set. And then we went all the way to Danny Kleinman, and they're amazing behind the scenes footage of that. That was a whole section. But when we were at 2 hours, it was like, well, we can take out 10 minutes like that and no one's going to miss it. But it was really beautiful. And it was a good way of getting into this idea of, what are those opening credits for? And so Neil and Rob, the Bond writers, were saying they likened it to, you come into a restaurant and someone, the waiter takes you over to a table and they sit you down and bring you a martini. That's what that opening bit is. It's like, okay, you have this bang moment at the beginning where you have the pre-credits sequence, and then now you're going to settle in, and the opening credits and the title song are going to ease you into the film and explain what you're going to, and now you're ready for the action, which I really liked. And Sheena Easton was very eloquent on how, the whole experience with Maurice and what a genius he was. And we got into a whole Saul Bass thing as well about how he kind of passed the baton on to Maurice. But again, and we also had a kind of sexism section which I really liked. And again, it was just a timing thing, was that not only is there a kind of sexism in those opening titles in the old ones, and that's had to evolve through the years, especially with Daniel Kleinman, but that there was a kind of, Apple, I think, particularly when they were doing it, were keen to try and deal with, like, is there a way we can tackle a little bit of this idea that Bond's had to evolve, not only musically, but also, its portrayal of women and so on. And I scratched my head about it, because obviously you say yes to everything at the beginning, because, we want everyone to be happy. But as we were doing it, I would every interview, I would ask the same question, which is like, look, is there any way to talk about sexism musically? Because that's the toughest thing for me. And a couple of people, Naomi Harris was one, who was great on this, and Anna Smith, who's a great film critic in the UK, both started talking about music and saying, well, in a weird way, music is kind of like a moral compass. And so when all that questionable stuff is going on in the early films, John Barry's music is so brilliant and so romantic that you can't, it just gives you a kind of a nod that this is okay. And so in a weird way, the music is kind of complicit. I mean, it has to be, because that's what it's doing. And it makes it palatable in a strange way. And so we had them talking about that. So I love that sequence. But again, it's like, for all the people there, they're going to be saying, let's play the hits, man. So had to hit the cutting room floor. But it was, there was lots of good stuff. But it's the same on every documentary, really.
Right.
Sure. Well, a couple of quick questions in a row, really. I note that you've mentioned sort of Apple, and it went to Amazon with the Amazon sort of deal. Was the documentary very different when it was an Apple piece, or was it minor adjustments when Amazon came through?
It didn't change. I mean, that's the great thing about having Barbara and Michael, is that they just shepherd the whole thing. So you're really talking to them rather than to anyone else. We got notes in from Apple, all of which were kind of fair enough, and we started to work on them. And then the whole Amazon thing was announced. And then Barbara just kind of rang and was like, no, it's going to be Amazon now, because it's like, we have to do it that way. And was like, okay, great. Are we changing? I hope we're not kind of changing horses in midstream, or no, just finish it kind of thing. So yeah, luckily for us, I mean, otherwise we'd still be cutting it. I think that, and they understood that it was tricky even just for us to hit that deadline. So I don't think we could have ever stopped in the middle and rethought it too much.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources, whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair. We're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hearts Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors, and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
It's the first part of our Christmas extravaganza. We are going to do a commentary for 1996's The Long Kiss Goodnight. Come dice some vegetables with Gina Davis, and let's have a merry time.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true spy hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx. Well, the other question I had, you mentioned the archives earlier and sort of being allowed access to the Bond archives. I'm sure there's still stuff you didn't even find from just the lack of time. But what were some of the biggest sort of revelations and findings you found? Did they make the finished product? But just some of the things you found whilst going through the archives that really surprised you.
I mean, it wasn't. So the main thing for me was just like, how can we tell the story when so many of the people involved, the key players, have passed away? So that was my main thing in the archive. And then, of course, like, are there any ways of illustrating these great anecdotes that I've heard through the years? So the starting point for me, there's a great book by John Burlingame called The Music of Bond. And that's a great primer. Yeah, you just go into there. It tells you everything in much more detail than we could ever hope to do. But then, so I kind of knew a lot of the stories, and then it's like, well, who's still around? I was amazed that Monty Norman was still alive at that point. I mean, sadly, he passed last year, but we got to do a couple of interviews with him, the last interviews he ever did, and so we just went to as many people as we could. But the great thing for me was, we got into the Eon archives, and they had all these tapes of interviews. So all those ones, the main thing I was concerned about was John, obviously, that would we find enough interviews with John Barry? And the first thing that turned up was all these tapes of interviews with him. We didn't use them all, mainly because it was just, I didn't want to hop between too many different archives and just get him at one point in his life to be telling these stories, rather than cutting to him and suddenly he's 70 and then the other one he's in he's in his 30s. But we ended up a lot of that stuff, we had a lot of behind the scenes stuff that came in, particularly for the modern era. I think certainly since Daniel Craig became Bond, Eon have been really amazing at capturing everything that goes on behind the scenes, and I'm sure some more of that will probably come out in the future, but we had a lot of that kind of stuff. And then there's bits and bobs through the years. There was things, again, the Maurice Binder thing, there's a few documentaries that have been made and a lot of great stills. but that was the majority of it. It wasn't like we found, I thought with the music, is there any chance that anyone taped Shirley Bassey back in the day? But it just wasn't that time. It's just not, it wasn't the done thing. You have kind of press photos for the most part. And then the recording process was more or less secret and behind closed doors. Having said that, obviously when Nancy Sinatra did her song, then they brought in the paparazzi, which is part of the problem. And that may be one of the reasons why they don't normally do that, because it's so intrusive. There was a lovely, in terms of real moments, we're like, oh, this is amazing. This is going to unlock the film. I'd hoped we might be able to get kind of tracks, bits of, audio maybe from the recordings where you might hear the run up to Goldfinger. And we didn't find it for Goldfinger, but we did find it from Russia with Love. And we had a whole section on Matt Monro at one point, and it was really lovely because for people who don't know, he was one of the great crooners of all time. He was admired by all the Rat Pack, and he has this incredible singing voice. But he was also a kind of 3 packs of cigarettes a day guy. He used to drink a bottle of whiskey by lunch, I think. Anyway, from recollection, that was his reputation. He was a bus driver who just had this incredible voice. So we had some audio tapes of him recording from Russia with Love, and you can hear John Barry doing it, and one take the orchestra screw up, and then the next take he's just about to hit that high note, and he's suddenly him go and coughing his guts. So sorry, I'm going to need another one, John. Which was lovely, and really suddenly breaks the whole thing apart. But that section again was one of those bits where it's like, well, we can take it out, and people probably won't miss it. They're definitely going to miss Goldfinger, but they won't miss From Russia with Love. Sadly, so at the end we put that song on the end credits because it's such a good one. But that was the kind of stuff that we found along the way. It's interesting because you're always looking for those moments of things that people will never have heard before. But actually, if it needs so much setting up that it's going to really eat into your running time, it's not always possible. But I was so happy when we found that, and then I was still trying to squeeze it into the film about a week before we finished, but there was no way.
Now you mentioned that a lot of the people that worked in Bond music have passed away over the many years. I would love to know, though, if there was anyone still living that you tried to get as an interview subject, but weren't able to.
Yeah, well, we asked everyone as a matter of course. So every single person. So anyone you can imagine that from all the singers to all the collaborators. In some cases, COVID got in the way a little bit. So Barbara at one point, I had vaguely thought about it, but Barbara at one point was like, are you gonna do the other Casino Royale? You're gonna do I assumed that was out of bounds, but I was going to ask the question, and she was like, oh no, you should do it. So we set up an interview with Burt Bacharach. We were going to go to his house, and then lockdown happened, and completely reasonably, I think his team were like, look, he's getting old now. I don't think it's a good idea to have a bunch of guys come over from the UK and potentially spread COVID around. So that fell apart at the last minute. There were a few things like that. And then some people, obviously this is more personal for them. So I'm not going to say who it is, but there's a couple of people who are quite ill, of people who've worked on Bond in the past. So they, again, they weren't really able to do it. And some people it's a scheduling thing. A few people who said yes, and they kept on saying yes, and then we would book the tickets, and then it wouldn't happen. I think we were due to go and interview Adele, and then there was the whole thing with her live tour. The gig didn't happen, and I think she had bigger stuff going on. Similarly with Paul McCartney, I think we booked that in about 10 times and it didn't happen. So, and that's happened on every single the documentary I've ever done. There's always one person or two people who slip the net, and it's difficult because obviously as a filmmaker you're desperate to speak to them, but also you have to have a kind of sense of humility about it in some way, because I think artists, the guys who do Bond, and it's a kind of who's who list of the greatest artists of the 20th and 21st century. So if you don't get them, that's fair enough. They've got other stuff going on in their lives. But yeah, we asked everyone. And as far as other people, I'm trying to think. Yeah, some people we just we had a few things booked in, and as it got closer to the end of the process, I was like, look, I don't want to waste anyone's time. I don't want to just interview people for the sake of interviewing them. So there were a few people who had been either composers and it didn't work out on the first trip, and then on the second trip. And I was like, look, what the worst thing is going to be if we travel to LA, spend all this money to go and interview someone, and they're not even in the finished film. So and then it was such a scramble to finish it. So yeah, there's certain people that I would love to have interviewed, and it was more a scheduling thing, or it was a COVID thing, or it was a money thing. Just we couldn't keep on crossing the Atlantic every couple of weeks. But yeah, that's tough because we had like a decent budget, but then on the other hand, we had to pay for all the music, and you have to pay for. There's so many things where the budget just disappears when you least expect it. At the beginning, everything's possible, and by the end, you're like literally just calling in favors right, left, and center.
The one I was the most curious about was hearing from Eric Serra. That this is the Bond nerd in me would have loved to have heard, because that score for GoldenEye was so experimental at the time, and I think still polarizing. So the general mainstream probably is not as interested in Eric Serra insights, but that was the one for me. I was like, oh, would have loved that.
I would have loved that too. We did speak to, we spoke to his team. He was up for doing an interview. He was over in Paris. Again, towards the end of the process, we were like, well, look, Jarvis Cocker did a cover of All Time High, and maybe we can go over there and see if we could get him at the same time as maybe getting, so like on each trip, we kind of had to justify it. If you're getting a film crew, you can't really do one person at a time. And then, Barbara was keen to have him in as well. I think they were very keen for us not just to do because I actually really love that score, but it was very controversial. And I love his music in general. I mean, he's a genius. So I've used the Leon score about 1 million times as temp music on my stuff, But it was just tricky. It was one of those things where, so the conversation you have all the time with John, the producer, and his team is just like, look, of course, go and shoot whatever you want. But if you're going to go and shoot Eric, that means you can't then go and do the trip and go and do Duran Duran. So which is more like, okay, fine. Well, let's do Duran Duran, and then I can come back and maybe there'll be more money at the end. So it was. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but it's I think there's a reason why you have deadlines, and there's a reason why directors aren't in charge of the budget. Otherwise, and it's a reason why I think people get dragged. Directors traditionally, everyone always says you don't finish a film, you abandon it, because you get dragged kicking and screaming away from the edit. You're still thinking, there's still things I want to try out. So yeah, it's a compromise, but in this case, it was. We got to a point towards the end where it was like, anyone else we start interviewing now is probably not going to end up in the film. And so, yeah, a few things fell aside, but it was, I regret it purely for the fact that I would love to go and hang out with those people and pick their brains.
There was, you kind of half answered my next question, so I'll probably jump into another one as well. But it's nice to hear that Casino Royale 67 could have got some love. And I assume Never Say Never Again was also in discussion at some point as well.
Yeah, I mean, they're great. I think great scores. I mean, Burt Bacharach is the greatest of all time. And the idea of going to hang out with him would have been amazing. One of the things I was most excited about. On the other hand, I didn't really want to kill him. So I did have that part. I don't be the
That's fair.
I don't want to have to put at the end, but no one died in the making of this film apart from Burt Bacharach. So and then we couldn't justify flying over it just for him, especially as we started to realize, you get at the beginning, you feel like, yeah, of course we'll squeeze everything in. And as you get closer and closer to the running time, you're like, oh God, something's got to give. The same thing, for everyone from when you're interviewing, I'm trying to think now who we spoke to. We spoke to a lot of graphic designers at one point as well, people who give us an idea of how Maurice worked and how Daniel worked. And we spoke to Daniel as well. We had all these great people. And then at a certain point, you're like, God, we've just spent a lot of money and time talking to all these people, which was fascinating for me, but never made the cut. So you kind of have to be sensible. But I would have loved that. And the Casino Royale score is, I think it's kind of when you watch the film, it's a bit of a kind of guilty pleasure. It's not a patch on the second Casino Royale, but the music is great.
Absolutely, and I have a follow-up question I want to ask about graphics. I'll get to that in a second, because I've got one more question I think I need to ask, and I don't want to make this like a whistle-stop tour of, hey, you didn't include this, or what happened there. So I suppose in a different angle, one thing I really love about the documentary is you include nods to Amy Winehouse and Radiohead, both being sort of, I would call, near misses. Was there any other near misses that you wanted to dive into that you found through the archives, or just sort of through popular media, knowing that they almost did it and you wanted to explore?
Yeah, we had a whole section, not a whole section, but a kind of 2-minute section on the Johnny Cash Thunderball, which was great and people were really excited about. Then we went to we couldn't clear it with the estate. Then a friend of mine who's a producer managed to get us in contact with the estate. They cleared it, then they wouldn't. The money was too much money, and sadly, because by the end of the process, it was a complete scramble to try and clear all this music before the deadline. And our music supervisors, who are amazing, came back and said, "Look, we just don't think we can do it in the time." And they don't, fair enough. They've just said no to the money, and we can't make an exception for them. And I wish I was by that stage. I'd gone off to go and shoot some stuff with Coldplay, and I was kind of like, well, win some, lose some. Well, actually, I think when I talked back to my friend, the producer, he was like, oh, I could have spoken to the archive and talked to the family, maybe. So there was a section on that. So Johnny Cash is great, and it's a beautiful tune. So as a massive Johnny Cash fan, I suggest people go and search that out on YouTube if they haven't heard it. We had a section just before that on Frank Sinatra and how Frank Sinatra came so close to initially doing You Only Live Twice and then doing Moonraker, and how he was friends with Cubby. I got to meet, and that was another great moment, was to get to meet and spend time with Nancy Sinatra, who's incredible. And she talked a bit about how she and Barbara grew up together and about that relationship. And that was lovely. So that was that whole thing kind of created one big section about all the songs that were near misses or didn't happen for any reason. And that's where we were going to put in Casino Royale and Never Say Never Again, as these kind of films, the songs that were Bond songs, but not Bond songs. And, because the song really in Casino Royale is Look of Love, which is one of the greatest songs of all time. So all that stuff, but it just didn't happen. And similarly, I just felt like you could kind of dip into the songs there that were influenced by Bond. And John Burlingame has a great section where he says, look, once John Barry creates that Bond template, it's almost impossible for later composers, whether as for the songs but mostly for the scores, to create music that doesn't sound like Bond, because that's what spies sound like. And so there's a raft of things, everything up to Mission Impossible, so that all these, and Our Man Flint, where it's music that is kind of Bond really, but it can't be Bond, And then of course you've got when John even does it himself, where he'll go off on a different tangent and creates other music, like for Harry Palmer and so on. So we had started to do a section on that, and I kind of abandoned it because I was like, it's never going to be in the film.
Well, the spy movie fan in me, which is what we talk about here every week on Spy Hards, is slightly gutted by losing that. But that's I completely understand the 90-minute thing there. I want to move us off of the near misses and the what could have beens and talk about what we've got and the wonderful documentary that it is. One thing that jumped out to me is the graphical presentation, which you wouldn't think it would be an important part of it, but because it's about sound. But there's I think I listed on the credits, the animator was Walter Ventura. If that's a company or a person, I don't know. I'm sorry, but I think the graphics are fantastic in this film. And so what went into working on those?
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah. So the team is there's a very good friend of mine, Mark Napton, and his team are called The Brewery, and they are they based in London, just behind Leicester Square. And I met them on, I think, the second project I ever did as a feature film, and we worked on everything ever since, on music videos, on documentaries, on films, everything. And they're just like, it's Mark and a team of very dedicated, lovely people who have this place in Leicester Square. It's a very small boutique place, and they work on everything from car ads to everything else. But what I love about Mark is he's just so can do. I have worked with big visual effects houses, and obviously they're amazing. But what I love about Mark is he's kind of like a guerrilla filmmaker, where he would just make things happen. So when we've been filming in the middle of a field and I've had an idea and gone, I think we could shoot on that film Ashes. This could be the ferry scene, and we could just film these three guys, and we hold up a wonky bit of green screen and say, can you just paint a ferry underneath them? He just makes it happen somehow, and the same thing with Bond. We brainstormed, like all film nerds, he's obsessed with Bond, and so he watched all the films back to back before I'd even had a chance to do it, and bought all the soundtracks and bought all the Bond graphical books and all that kind of stuff. And then we brainstormed for a bit, and my initial take on the thing was, look, I don't know if the archive is going to be there. I have no idea what Eon are going to give us or what we can find ourselves, but I'm sure there's going to be great anecdotes already from reading John Burlingame's book. There's all the things like, about when the great story that Michael Caine tells about how he was the first person ever to hear Goldfinger. And I really want to get into the swinging 60s, and I want to get into how the world of musicals was where Bond started, with everyone from Lionel Bart to all these fantastic writers. kind of created the songs because that's what, makes it's an obvious starting point. How are we going to do it? Well, let's look at kind of graphical things. Maybe we steal the silhouette idea from the beginning of Casino Royale, and you'll use that to illustrate it. And then at the end, if we're going to have our own song, when we were thinking of having a song evolve through the film, then at the end we'll have our own opening credits, but they'll be for this new song. And so we threw out all these different ideas. They started experimenting with some of this stuff, and it was looking really good. But then the question was, well, look, if the archive actually is good, and rather than just being too clever and having tons of silhouettes and creating silhouettes of Michael Caine, look, if we've got footage from his films where you can actually see the real Michael Caine doing it, then having a silhouette with kind of traditional, the big glasses is kind of less interesting in a way. So maybe we're just being too clever. So we got to a point where I was like, look, we'll do everything we can in the edit, and then we'll bring it back to you, and you will start throwing ideas back and forth. And we were lucky that our assembly editor, Sam, is amazing with graphics as well. So he started playing around with stuff, and actually it got to a level where it was so sophisticated. I was like, well, to be honest, you should go and sit in with Mark, and you guys just work together. So he would do stuff, then Mark would use it, then Mark would do something different for another section. And it was really just those guys brainstorming, just trying to find the most interesting visual ways of communicating this. Because the one thing I had was like, well, it shouldn't, I think with graphics, they can't be distracting, obviously, but if they can help you listen to the music, if you see, most people don't understand precisely musical notation, but you can understand if a note's going up or coming down. So I was like, just to help people pick themes out and ideas out, if we could take the dot to know dots from, which obviously have been used in No Time to Die, and we used, at the very beginning of the series, if we can use those as musical notation and use the color of those and use that as a way of also, and then Mark was like, great, well, why don't I use those as transitional devices? So instead of just wiping or cutting, we'll use the dots as a way in and out of scenes and so on. So it just becomes a great collaboration. And for me, it's like the one thing I did promise to Apple when it was Apple at the beginning, and to Barbara, is that, look, what we don't want is something that's going to send people to sleep. Bond films are entertaining. They're visually stunning. So the documentary should be entertaining and should be impactful. And the visuals should be telling the story as well, rather than just, we didn't want to just make a kind of a documentary. As great as some of those documentaries are about John Barry and so on from the past that we were looking and using as a resource, they can sometimes be a bit pedestrian visually. And so that was the one thing I said, look, you should be telling an exciting story. We shouldn't just be, people shouldn't be feeling like they're twiddling their thumbs at any point.
I remember seeing the poster artwork coming out of the screening at the BFI. You had it all plastered around, and I'm deeply sad that there wasn't any for sale in the shop. I'm still trying to track one of those down, because that poster is wonderful. I can't find them anywhere.
Oh, really? I wonder. I'll see if we can, in the edit suite, we've got any. They sent us a few. If the edit team have all taken them, I'll see if I can rustle something up. We must have one. Not so.
That's very kind of you. No, it's beautiful. Like just the incorporation of like a vinyl record with the sort of the gun barrel. Wonderful work. Wonderful.
Yeah,
stuff.
they did a great job. That was I'm gonna mess this up now. I was gonna say it was Empire Design. I think it was Empire Design. But yeah, the other lovely thing about that is I was the process at the end when they start sending you all the different ideas, and you get the kind of mood boards. I love all that side of things. We had the same thing on the Coldplay one. They went out to this company, and I think everyone got so excited about it. Every single designer that ever worked with sent over about 5 different posters. So we had about 100 posters for the final thing. And again, I suppose it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's such a subjective taste, because all the ones I picked, no one else liked. So I've obviously got terrible taste or very niche taste. But yeah, there's some great ones for this as well.
So, have you been pleased with the reception you've gotten from the documentary? Because it's one thing to sit in the room and see it in a theater, but obviously online people have been talking about it, and even like the Eon people, themselves as well. What has been your take on the reception?
Yeah, it's been wonderful. It's been really lovely. I mean, you don't know when you're working on something. Obviously, people love Bond, so there is always that inbuilt kind of safety net underneath, which is just like, look, even if it was terrible, we know that the films and the music are great, so people are going to tune in anyway. So there is that side of things. But yeah, I think the response has been great, and I think I hope people understand that it can never hope. There's no way we could ever satisfy everyone's need for like complete detail on everything. So it really had to be a kind of taster. I think some of my ideas of kind of pushing it too far in the John Barry direction or going off and writing a new Bond song, actually I imagine maybe they might have possibly been kind of more experimental. So in that sense, interesting, but actually I think might have pissed off a lot of fans. So maybe it was good that we didn't go in that direction. And I think it's been great. In terms of going back, there was nothing in it where there was no point where I was really happy that, for example, when I wanted to put in Radiohead and Amy, and when I started talking to Barbara and Michael about that in the interviews, they didn't push back on anything. They were very encouraging. And similarly for the sequences, like the sequence that finishes the film, where we get into a relative amount of nerdy detail with Hans and with Steve and with everyone, which I love as a music fan, but is not necessary to everyone's taste. And I love the fact they supported us on that and encouraged us in that direction. So no, that was great. So I'm really happy. And I think, social media gets a lot of stick, but the great thing for me is you do get to interact with people and you see if people like it. And generally they've been really super supportive. So I hope we've done it justice. You can only do what you can do in 90 minutes, but I feel like as a fan myself, I'm glad people have enjoyed it.
And from everyone I've spoken to online, it's wonderful, and a wonderful celebration of 60 years of James Bond. So I think you've really helped, that transition year, that big year of 60 years of Bond. What's your favorite moment from the documentary, looking back on it now?
Oh, from the actual film? That's a good question. I mean, I've got a lot of favorite bits. I think I would say that the moment that I really, really enjoyed, again, this is just purely from being a music nerd, was getting to sit in a room with David and with Hans and with Steve, people of that caliber, and be able to just ask them stupid questions, kind of layman's questions. It was like, well, look, I feel very moved by this music. I had a kind of classical music background and upbringing. I play music and play instruments and stuff, but so I'm not a complete idiot. But I, like, how would you even approach that, and how does the process work? And obviously I'm a film director, so I know the normal procedure, but how does it work on a Bond film and everything's so much bigger and more pressured, and who gets to call the shots, doing that kind of thing. And so when the first person we met was Cary Fukunaga, and he gave us a great interview. And he, at one point, I just said, look, how does it work? Like that final sequence, which is key to the whole Craig era in the end, and but is very, very difficult to pull off. And it was controversial, and some people didn't like it conceptually, but I don't think many people out there can deny how brilliantly it was put together. You might say it was the wrong move with the Bond character. Personally, I thought it was really gutsy and was a brave thing to do. But the way that the music lifts it, as Daniel said, was amazing. I just like, how did that come about? And then he told us that idea of, that he was there with Hans, and the way that Hans works is so kind of spontaneous that he said, look, I think this needs to sound like a requiem. This is what this whole section is. And as he was walking out the door, Hans said, well, like this, and began writing, kind of playing it in real time, using elements that Steve Mazzaro had also worked with Hans and he had kind of brought together. So I was like, oh, that's great. That feels like a real moment where you're in the room with them. And so, luckily for me, a week later, I was in a room with Hans. And so I could literally get him to talk back to Cary in the film. And a week after that, I was flew over to go meet Steve. And then, a week after that, I was meeting Daniel. So you had a chance to get all these people to speak to each other in a way that they normally don't. I mean, that's the thing about musicians. They tend to be more instinctive, and they'll just do things, whereas actually a lot of the time I was getting to ask them, and they were having to think about things, think them through, and kind of verbalize them for the first time. And then again, it's funny with someone like Daniel, and the same thing with Rami Malek and Naomi Harris and so on. I thought, I don't want to interview them anyway. They might say they don't have anything to say about this subject, but what I loved was that, in that classic kind of self-deprecating way, they all start off again, listen, I have no idea why you want to talk to me because I don't know anything about music. And then went on to give us these amazingly eloquent, insightful answers about what it is that the music does, and how important it was, for example, for Daniel to have we have all the time in the world because it's there in the script, and then it becomes this key theme. And so that moment towards the end where you get to hear how, just as John Barry had conceived it, this is kind of the 21st century version where you have not only the singer quoting motifs from her song, but she actually sings in it. And then you're quoting John Barry, you're quoting Billy, and then you're creating a kind of this hybrid of all these elements. And then you have to update the Bond theme to make it emotional in a way that has been difficult in the past. But if you're a genius like Hans and Steve, then you can do it. So that was one of the bits that I got excited about. And it's funny because something that I cut together at 2 a.m. the night before we met, in a moment of utter panic, thinking that Barbara and Michael were coming in and we'd probably all get fired in the morning, and that they liked. And then actually it was like, well, if they like it that much, let's use it as the end of the film. Maybe that's a good out. So it was, I think that's probably my favorite bit. But having said that, when we found that footage of Michael Caine talking eloquently about his friend John Barry, and hearing about how he was the first person to hear the music for Goldfinger, and it kept him up all night, I was like, I'm so happy that the swinging 60s are exactly as the way that I thought they would be, or I hope they would be. Then of course, John Barry had Michael Caine sleeping on his sofa because Michael Caine got kicked out of his own flat for womanizing. I think it's great. I'm so glad it was as cool as I thought it was.
And I suppose then, sort of stepping away from the documentary now, I suppose I have to ask you on sort of behalf of Bond fans everywhere, what's your favorite Bond song?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $60 million question, isn't it? I think, and again, it would change probably depending on what day you ask me or what hour of the day you ask me, because they all mean something different to me. And they represent different eras of my life because, some I wasn't around for, but I grew up with, and some meant something to me because I was discovering them by myself, without my parents. And then obviously as the series has evolved, they've come to mean different things to me at different chapters in my life. And the fact that my kids grew up with the music for No Time to Die and sing that, because Billie Eilish means something to them now, that gives it an added level of meaning. I think that's what music does so brilliantly, is that, it kind of exists outside the films, and it has its own meaning. And the idea, John Burlingame walked down the aisle to We Have All the Time in the World. So now for him, not only is it a song that has a kind of tragic element, it also has a joyful element. And of course it was something that Louis Armstrong sang at the end of his life, so it has that, and obviously it's attached to now 2 tragic endings to 2 different films, Bond films. So I for me, if I had to just go purely on what I think is like the greatest of all of them, I would say it's probably, for me, it's We Have All the Time in the World. It has the most resonance. Having said that, my first favorite in terms of one that I discovered and meant something to me is the A-ha Living Daylights, which is funny. Again, when you make a film like this, you meet everyone, and I think that's one of the ones that gets less love amongst fans, but I really enjoy. And then I suppose, it's funny how you reassess songs. I love the David Arnold Chris Cornell song, but when at the Albert Hall the other night when David sang it, because obviously Chris is no longer sadly around to sing it, and I grew up as a massive Soundgarden fan and Chris Cornell fan. It had so much poignancy, which is odd to say for such a kind of raucous, in-your-face rock song, but it suddenly had this other level of emotion to it, which I'd never ascribed to it before. So I love all those songs. And I also, I'm a massive Jack White Stripes fan, and so Another Way to Die again was one of the controversial ones for some reason, but that's one that we play a lot in the edit suite, and it's a great song in its own right. But they're all great songs in their right, and even some of the ones that people start giving a bit of flack in our film, they're still other people's favorites, And All Time High is one of my best friends. She was like, I hope you're doing an All Time High section, because it's her favorite song. It's a softer song than people have been used to for Bond, but it's a fantastic. It's John Barry. How can it be bad?
It's one I find myself singing, to be fair. All Time High gets, I'll hum it quite a lot. But I'll just speak to your point about the Royal Albert Hall concert. I was there as well, and I'm also a huge Chris Cornell, Soundgarden, Temple of the Dog fan. And just hearing David Arnold give sort of a heartbreaking yet also really loving rendition of the song was quite, I'll just say my allergies were playing up by the end.
Exactly. And the fact that you have Shirley Bassey just steps out, and before she sang a note, the entire room, the entire hall is on its feet. It's funny because obviously I was excited to go, but then I was like, well, I know these songs, it's going to be a fun night. But actually, it was surprisingly emotional. And when those scores were played, it's very beautiful. And all the different it's funny. I suddenly realized at the end, and I was thinking, are they going to do No Time to Die for an encore? That was one of the few songs they didn't play, but it was it was really wonderful. And again, so those songs are so versatile that people can sing them in different ways, which again is like all the different interpretations I love. So it just gives the Bond film. I think it's not that, you know, the songs, obviously the people love the Bond films for a lot of different reasons, but I don't know whether it would have survived, the series would have survived for 60 years without those iconic scores and those iconic songs. It's what makes Bond Bond, I think.
And, you know, you do have another bit of a Bond connection I feel like we would be remiss not to mention. I was just curious about how you got attached to the Fleming miniseries.
Right. Well, again, I mean, I was a massive Bond fan. I hadn't read all the books. I have now for this. I went back and watched all the films and read all the books finally. But I'd read a few. My dad, I think, had a copy of Casino Royale at home and Diamonds Forever and a couple of those. So I knew a bit about Ian Fleming, but not that much. We'd been working on this project called GB84, which was a book about a kind of thriller about the miners' strike, and we'd been working on it for about 7 years or something like that. And we thought we were getting to a point where we were close to making it. I'm not going to mention the broadcaster, but it was because I want to work with them again. But we thought we were getting close, and then suddenly it was like, oh no, they're not really interested anymore. And I suddenly just found this happens, but I found myself suddenly without this job that we thought we were doing, and would be the next 2 years of our lives. And so I just rang my agent, and normally, not always, but often the films that I've worked on are self-generated or they come through my own connections, but sometimes they come through my agent. And I just rang her and said, listen, I'm out of work now. I thought we were going into this thing and I need something. And so she just sent me the scripts, and one of her writers had written this thing and worked for a long time on it. And originally it was going to be done with Benedict Cumberbatch as a film. And then I think Sky Atlantic came on board and they said, look, we want Dominic Cooper for this, and we want to shoot it. And Dominic Cooper was only available, say, in January and February, well, beginning January and February. He had this window of like 2 months or 3 months when he was available to shoot, and then he was going off onto some massive film, onto World of Warcraft, and so he wasn't going to be available for another year. And so it's like, look, you can shoot with him or you don't shoot, but these scripts are not quite ready because Sky Atlantic want to keep working on them. Do you just hit the ground running? And so I think I went in on Monday and I said, look, this is why I would do it, because I think even though the scripts were great, the concept of it was, I was like, look, I'm a Bond fan. I don't know that much about Ian Fleming. I did due diligence the night before and went online and read up on him, but I was going into it cold, and I was like, the scripts are really fun. The pitch was, look, Ian Fleming, it was a little bit tongue in cheek. It was more kind of Pierce Brosnan than Sean Connery.
Right.
But the idea really was, Ian Fleming it was almost like an origin story for Bond. So it was kind of like, you know, like you would have a superhero film, like an origin story for the writer of Bond. So it starts off with Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming is this kind of playboy who has been fired from every single job his family connections have ever got him. And then the war happens, and it's the making of him. He becomes a spy, but he becomes a desk-bound spy. And he's desperate to be James Bond, but his curse is that he never will, but he'll end up creating James Bond and writing about him. So he comes close to all these things, but he never actually comes. But each of these encounters informs the writer he's going to be. And so that was the take on it. And Dominic, I knew I'd met before. He was like he's just socially, he's just a lovely guy. And so we met, we're like, let's just go for it. And we'll make it happen somewhere. So, and because it's tongue in cheek, we got to kind of create these Bond-like sequences, not on a Bond budget. You know, we're shooting, I think on a Bond film, they shoot, you know, action sequences over weeks and months, and they would shoot a sex scene over a weekend. You know, there's like, we would be shooting like a sex scene in half an hour in the morning, then crossing, you know, we were shooting in Budapest, then crossing town to go and blow up a tank and then running, but you know, it was all like that. But it was a lot of fun. And it was just one of those things where I enjoy. It was almost like doing a kind of low budget film with a decent budget, because we just had to run around, but we were trying to make a Bond film on an indie film budget. Having said that, you know, we had tanks and big explosions, and you know, we had great casts, and it was one of those nuts moments where, you know, I was talking to my wife, my girlfriend at the time, and I went in on Monday just to say, look, there's this potential job coming up. On the Friday, I left for Budapest. I don't think I came back for 6 months. So part that, which was amazing pre-kids, and then we had our first daughter just after that, and I think that's when slowing down and doing documentaries was nice. I think we're hopefully doing a drama next, and so I'm excited to go back into that, because bar the odd bit of filming here and there, we've mostly been doing documentaries. We've done music videos and we've done Red Nose Day stuff, and I've worked with Vic and Bob, these comedians in the UK who I grew up loving, and they're like they're legends who I basically worship, and so I got to do that a couple of times. But yeah, going back to dramas is exciting. But Fleming was amazing. It was real, yeah. And they kind of, because we were in Budapest, they just said to get on with it, and we came back. We went off and shot a bunch of stuff and came back and trying to piece it together with it. But it was really fun. It's probably the closest I get to making an actual Bond film.
Never say never.
True, but it's nice. I mean, I think the great thing about Bond is that as it evolves through the times, who knows who the next Bond is going to be. We've all got suggestions, but they haven't got that far in the process yet by the sounds of things. But maybe it needs to be a woman director. Maybe it needs to be a black Bond. All these things. I think I think white middle class directors have had a fair shot, and maybe it's time for someone else to do it. But look, if Barbara rings tomorrow and asks me to do the next Bond film, I'm definitely not going to say no. But I think it's what's exciting is that they're obviously thinking about doing something different. I think the only tiny glimmer that they've kind of tiny hint that they've given about the future is they want to do something different and shake it up in the same way they did with Daniel, which is great. It's what they should do. So and that's what's going to keep the franchise alive, I guess.
Totally.
Well, it's interesting, just as sort of the story of this podcast. I didn't think we would have the definitive story of the Fleming TV show, because we've also had one of the writers, Don McPherson, on the show over a year or so ago.
How funny!
I didn't think this would happen. Yeah, small world, because he did the Avengers from 1998, so that's how we got on the show. But
that's so funny. Oh, Don's amazing. He lives over in Islington. I need to look him up because I haven't seen him for a while. But he's a wonderful person. Mm-hmm. Him and Anne-Marie, his wife. I mean, they're just. Yeah, they're very, very lovely people. I mean, so basically, to cut long story short, he came on board that very last minute, and I'd met him because Michael Winterbottom was doing a film called Goal, which Don came on board to come and write. I was editing, and then the whole thing fell apart. And it was one night, drunken night, just before we went out to go and shoot Goal, that I pitched Road to Guantanamo to Michael. Michael said, "Oh no, let's do it together." So I met Don on that, and then that film fell apart, and he'd had a huge success being a ghostwriter, being one of those kind of script doctors who, obviously get paid a lot of money and are essential to the way that Hollywood works, but don't get much credit. So he was chomping the bit, and he almost got to do Goal, and that fell apart. And then I got to work with him on Fleming, and he's so talented, he's so brilliant, but he hasn't, his name has not been put on enough things. And so to do Fleming, it was just fantastic. I used to go and sit over with him, we'd brainstorm, and he'd sit there bashing out things, and he has the kind of energy and inventiveness of someone who's just starting out, even though he's very experienced. So yeah, that was a real joy working with him.
And it has a genuine love for, just from our chat anyway, and our emails we've exchanged, of just spy movies and spy stories, and Fleming and the Avengers TV shows, all the stuff he's involved with. A couple of quick questions before we let you go, Matt. I know it's been a long chat. We've done an hour and a half on this. Firstly, I want to know what you mentioned it briefly, but what are you working on at the moment? What have you got on the horizon?
Well, so as we were doing these, we've been working on various different documentaries, and I had an amazing experience working with James Gay Rees. So we did Supersonic with him and Asif Kapadia, and then we did The Kings with him and Paul Martin, and they came and pitched us a few projects. There's one project that it's tricky to talk about all these things because they haven't happened yet, and they might not happen, I guess. But I hope they're looking positive. Anyway, we've got one project with him, which is really exciting. Having said I'm never going to do any more music documentaries, then I always get another opportunity. And then, so Sound of 007 was like, oh, okay, I'll do one more, but that's it. I'm not going to do any more. And then I got pitched another really great one by one of my favorite bands. I was like, oh, okay, so that's hovering as well. It's trying to land planes. I'm very lucky now to be at a stage where you're more in demand than you're able to kind of fulfill. And then, but I'd kind of said to myself that I think at least around the time of Bond, I want to move back into drama again, if my kids and my wife don't mind. It is a big ask. I mean, I think it's 5 or 6 weeks when you end up being very unavailable. So I don't want to do it too often, but yeah, I'm kind of missed it. And so we have one. So we've got various different things. I've got a project we're working title, which was originally a film that I wrote with Jack Thorne, which is, again, I can't talk too much about, but it's a kind of it's a ghost story. And they came back to me a couple of years ago and said, "Oh, actually, we don't want to do it as feature, we want to do it as TV." So me and a friend of mine is a writer director, Iran Creevy, who did Welcome to the Punch and Shifty. He's one of my best mates. We've now rewritten it as a TV show. So they're now going off and looking at what we've done and thinking about that. So hopefully but that won't be the next thing. Then we got approached by another couple of producers who have this amazing murder mystery, which is what I think we're doing next. And it's incredibly exciting. But then, that would be the next thing. But then we've also got Andrew Eaton, Michael Winterbottom's producer earlier, and now he produces by himself. He has a project that he wants to do with me, and he was originally going to do GB84. That was his project. So these things come round, and one thing I can say is that it is nearly always completely impossible to predict, because I certainly didn't think we were going to be doing Sound of 007 when we did it, because we had 2 other projects that were supposed to be happening before. One of which is still hopefully happening. So it's very difficult to know. And then on top of that, we've got I've optioned a series of children's books that I want to turn into a couple of films if we can make them. So hopefully leaning more on dramas in the future. But I love documentaries, and I love music videos, and I love comedy when I've been lucky enough to go off with Vic and Bob and so on. So things turn up all the time. I'm lucky enough that the phone rings relatively often. Like last week, I was in the middle of doing prep on this film, so I couldn't do it. But Children in Need rang asking me to go and shoot some stuff for them. So you never really know what the next thing is going to be. And there've been a few projects that it's probably not fair to talk about, but where either it didn't work out timing wise, or someone else has come in and you end up not getting the job after working on it. So there've been a few of those through the years. Where that's just the nature of working in any business, freelance business. So who knows? Maybe it could not be any of those things. The phone could ring next week, and it turns out they found someone much better to do the job. So can't really. Someone was saying to me yesterday, you can't. A film's never. You can never count on a film until you're waiting by the catering truck. I know that's definitely true.
And I suppose the final question that it is the final question, because it's what we ask everyone from John, Glenn, Mariam, Darbo, all the Bond greats that have been on the show, directors, screenwriters. The question is, Matt Whitecross, what is your favorite spy movie?
Wow, that is a great question. I would have to say, and now I'm really thinking on my feet, because I'm as soon as we hang up, I'm going to think of my real favorite spy story. I mean, it's tricky. It's tricky because my instinct would be to go for Casino Royale, because it's I think the Daniel Craig Casino Royale is one of the greatest films of all time. Anyway, but I think I don't know whether it would be it'd probably be one of the ones that I'd watch with my dad growing up. Like kind of Odd Man Out, or would you consider that a spy movie? I mean, I guess it's got. Or I'm trying to think. I love war movies, and I love and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Well, I mean, the TV series obviously, but the more recent film was great. That's a good question though, because obviously I love the big action ones. I love the Bourne films. I love the Bond films, but the ones that struck me as truest were the ones where like Tinker Tailor, where you're like, being a spy is horrible and kind of and involves a lot of waiting around and a lot of kind of machinations, and it's not as glamorous and much, because I think Bond doesn't spend very much time doing his spying, certainly not in this day and age. He spends a lot of time killing people. He's basically, someone else was saying this recently, just that he's evolved into an assassin more than a spy. He doesn't do that much detective work anymore. What are the great spy movies? Got me on my brainstorm me some spy movies, and then I'll come up with. But I'm just trying to think what.
I mean, give us like an era. We could give you a bunch of films, because it's basically what we do on the show is chart.
Yeah.
So. No,
exactly. I mean, Harry Palmer's amazing as well, but
yeah,
I'm trying to think of my favorite. Yeah, it would probably be from the 40s or 50s, but I'm struggling now to. My brain is. This is what happens when you've got an 8-month-old. I can't even remember my name.
I can tell you, like, Mariam Dabo picked The Third Man I remember.
Well, I was going to say Third Man because that's Carol Reed as well. Is that a spy movie though? I was thinking it's
It
kind
has
of
espionage, like pretty heavy
yeah,
espionage elements, but yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's one of the great all-time films. Let's have a look. What does Wikipedia say the best films are? Let me just see if any of these really resonate for me. Best spy movies. Come on. I would say. I mean, it would definitely have to be that, or in the 70s. What have we said? So obviously Harry Palmer.
You got like 3 Days of the Condor, that Parallax View, that sort of stuff in the 70s.
Oh yeah, I mean Parallax View is great, but is it a spy movie again? It's a kind of conspiracy.
It's a borderline case, that one is.
They put Austin Powers.
Yeah.
I mean, Austin Powers must have been so. That's amazing. Oh yeah, Lady Vanishes. I mean, that's genius.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
but the conversation. Yeah, I suppose the conversation is a spy movie, even though it's not. Well, that's in my top 10 films of all time, 100%. So I'd have to go for that. But it's funny because of course he is a spy, but I don't really think of him as being a spy movie because it's not set against a war backdrop. But then why would it be? It's got to be. I mean, I would imagine it's either Conversation or The Lives of Others. One of those two. Yeah. But I mean, I'd have to say The Conversation just because it's, if I, push came to shove, it would definitely probably be in my top 5 films of all time. I mean, I love that one.
No, that's a fantastic pick for sure.
But it's hard though, isn't it? Because there's so many. What else is Wikipedia offering up? Bridge of Spies, yeah, that's good. Mission Impossible, yeah, I suppose. Enemy of the State, Argo, Tinker Tailor. We talked about Bourne. Oh yeah, Imitation Game, Men Who Stare at Goats. And Notorious. I can't believe I forgot Notorious. Oh god,
I wondered if you were going to mention Hitchcock or not. There's a lot there.
39 Steps. I mean, 39 Steps is that's. I don't know if it's my favorite film, but it's definitely my comfort film. But if it's like a winter day and you're sitting 3 Days of Condor as well, but yeah, if you're sitting at home and you've basically got the lurgy and you can't, it's like you want to curl up on with a duvet and on the sofa and watch that. North by Northwest. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. Yeah, here they got Lives of Others, Third Man. Yeah, so they consider Third Man. Well, I'm going to go for The Conversation with reluctance because there's so many other good ones. But yeah, that's one of the best.
We have no complaints. It's keeping us in business. There being so many good ones, so that's it's fine. But The Conversation is an excellent pick, and I think on that note, Matt, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us on the show to chart the course of the sound of 007. You've been very generous. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, there you go, folks. That was our chat with Mr. Matt Whitecross himself. Again, I want to thank Matt for his time. Wonderful discussion. Cam, where do we start?
Yes, this was a very detailed interview. And I think, often when we talk to people about whether it's a Bond movie or some various other spy project, it's many years in the rearview mirror. And so it's often, you're relying on human memory, in some cases to go back even 50 or 60 years and try to remember what happened on a set or something like that. Whereas here, Matt has just relatively recently released the sound of 007, not just to a theater audience at the Celebration in Britain there, but also on Amazon Prime. So this was very fresh in his mind, and I think we got way more information than we would have gotten at a different time in history.
Absolutely, and at the beginning of the discussion, we sort of charted the course of Matt's career leading to this point, and his upbringing as well, and it felt like all the roads led him to the sound of 007. It feels like the perfect encapsulation of the work he's done so far. Worked in, music documentaries, watching Bond growing up. It all kind of culminated with this, also working on the Fleming TV show, which we sort of spoke about towards the end as well. Yeah, so we could pull it apart and speak about all the anecdotes, but I think what I got from it was this was a man who genuinely cared about the sound of 007 and wanted to give us the best version of that documentary he could. Obviously, there were constraints, like the 90-minute runtime, budgets, things like that. It wasn't like carte blanche, do what you want. But I think within those constraints, we got a wonderful, wonderful documentary.
Definitely. I mean, the documentary itself is just such an entertainment. And I remember when I finished watching it, I just texted my sister and said, this documentary makes you want to rewatch the Bond movies for a week. It really does its job fantastically well. And I think what's really interesting is because going into this, I think like anyone who watched the documentary, you have your questions of wait a second, why wasn't this song mentioned or whatever? Like, why didn't they delve deeper into that particular subject? And we say that as diehards, not as more of a casual viewer of the documentary. But what I was really interested was hearing Matt detail some of the things he desperately wanted to somehow get into the documentary that just didn't make it. Like, they just did not work into what the final form was when you basically sculpt it down to its 90-minute, runtime. And he had so many other things that fans never would have realized that he was dreaming of working in there that were all interesting. And I'm sure we would all love to see a, Blu-ray release of this with like 7 hours of deleted footage. But nonetheless, it sounds like it was a lot of ambition going on from him. And it's just about what ultimately the evolution of the project was.
Absolutely. He spoke about, at one point they wanted to create their own Bond song, talking to experts who have created the Bond songs and put together what they think the perfect version is. And, the nerd, the music nerd in me, and the spy hard in me wants to sort of see what that was, because I always root for the underdogs. Never Say Never Again, Casino Royale 67, they're like the people I fight for online, because I want to hear what sort of the outside of the bubble is doing. And that's fascinating, but I understand completely why it didn't make the final cut of the film. And I think it was a wise choice, really, because it took focus off telling the story of the sound of 007 when they're talking about what their version of the sound of 007 is. So totally get that. And, we speak of Casino Royale 67. We speak of Never Say Never Again. I genuinely thought they would be, don't touch those films, because the thing you always hear, and it's always spoken about online, and I think this is kind of the first time I've ever heard this acknowledged, is that the powers that be don't mind those films. Barbara Broccoli said, why don't you do Casino Royale 67? But people on Twitter will tell you, oh, they hate those films. No,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure they're happy to make some money off those films if they can.
The fact that they're listed on the Amazon section with the other James Bond movies is maybe a little bit of a hint that, well, when they were dealing with Amazon after the purchase, they weren't saying, you make sure to keep those movies away. Put those into the anonymous bin of streaming.
Yeah, just change the D in Bond to a G. It's James Bong films. Don't let people find them.
Yeah, and put it next to Half Baked and the Cheech and Chong films in the Amazon streaming network.
Perfect. But yeah, I mean, they're ultimately happy to make $1 or $2 off of these films. And much as some people will try and deny it online, they are part of the Bond canon. They are James Bond films. And so it's interesting that at one point they had an interview planned with Burt Bacharach. They didn't mention who it was, but they had stuff planned for Never Say Never Again as well. I mean, I don't know if Lani Hall's still kicking about, but maybe it was her. Who knows? And that really excites me as the guy who likes to sort of back up the underdog. And, we spoke at length about, and I didn't want to dwell on this too much, and I think that came through in the discussion, but what could have been, all the things you didn't put in, and you see this sort of discussion online. But it is interesting to explore that. And, I asked about sort of the near misses, the things like the Amy Winehouse and the Radiohead that was included in the documentary. Was there more? Was there more things that he found in the vaults that he wanted to focus on? And we found out there was an extended sequence with Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
That they just couldn't get the rights to. I think there was something with Frank Sinatra as well that was in discussion.
Yep.
And I'm sure there was a couple more that he didn't mention or that were in the planning stages. And it just finance, time, these things are real problems when it comes to putting films and TV, documentaries together, and they're real considerations to make. And I think he made the right choice for the finished product, but boy, is it interesting to hear about them.
Yeah, I mean, as a huge Alice Cooper fan, I would have loved a little bit of a section on his Man with the Golden Gun theme. But I can recognize the importance of the documentary as a whole, and that we are now taking it down weird diversions just to entertain me.
I mean, would I have liked a 10-minute discussion on The Look of Love? Absolutely. But something that jumped out to you about the discussion, Cam?
Yeah, I mean, just the amount of thought that went into it and just the evolution of a documentary, because there are movies and I mean fictional films, narrative films where there will be upsets along the way that'll change the creative direction of it. You think of something like Rogue One, for example, which went through a lot of reshoots that reshaped the movie. It does happen, but typically those movies are acknowledged as a mess, in terms of being productions, and they get a lot of press for that. Whereas with documentaries, that's just frequently the case. Like they kind of change directions and evolve over the course of the putting together and the research and all that sort of stuff. So hearing him detail initially kind of building it all around kind of this John Barry biography sort of narrative spine, elements like that, and how the documentary constantly changed leading into where it sits now as a finished product, I just always find really interesting because it's so common with documentaries, but we don't really get to examine it too often, in terms of interviews with directors and hearing these long form kind of discussions of the process.
Yeah, like seeing it evolve and also go through different like producers in a sense of Apple and then eventually Amazon and seeing what everyone wants. So serving a few masters, it's definitely a hard thing to balance. And I can understand why he pulled back from the sort of John Barry retrospective. Much as it's wonderful, and like you say, I'd love to see a Blu-ray release that's 5 hours long, and I get my Larney Hall discussion. Sign me up. But
Yeah.
I could, and it's interesting to see like what goes into the decision making to take these things away. And one thing I didn't actually ask the question, but he actually answered it for me before I asked it, which is about sort of the non-linear narrative that the film follows, where it like starts with No Time to Die and ends with No Time to Die, but in between it weaves the story of the Bond song, the Bond theme, and how that was more to do with like building into what's happened and the fact that No Time to Die really builds off of what came before and using that as kind of the thing to start and culminate the film, which I think actually looking at it now and from that perspective was a really wonderful choice.
Yeah, definitely. I thought that like there was a lot of insight given here to this documentary that I think all most fans were really into the documentary, and I think just the amount of information he could bring about it was really rewarding to listen to, and hopefully for all of you listening now to hear back.
Yeah, overall, it was a wonderful discussion, and I'm glad we got the chance to speak with Matt. I hope everyone enjoyed the documentary as well, and I hope everyone's enjoyed the last 2 weeks of Bond coverage. I think it's been some very insightful stuff. Our two Quantum of Solace interviews, obviously, our Quantum of Solace review with David Zaritsky, and now our interview about the sound of 007. It's been quite the Bond extravaganza.
Yes, the bar is being raised for Skyfall, Scott.
Yeah, how can we top it? Well, don't worry, folks, because things are proceeding on what we're going to do for Skyfall. You got to remember, Skyfall was a big event here in the UK in 2012, so hopefully we can match the Olympics. Hopefully, we can match the Olympics, Cam.
Damn right.
But before we let everyone go, Cam, I hear some sleigh bells ringing. What could we be doing next week?
Well, Scott, we have a tradition of covering Christmas-based spy films for the Christmas break, and we tackled The Long Kiss Goodnight back in the day. Last year, we did On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This year, we're going to do one maybe a little more obscure, but featuring a very powerhouse actor. We are going to tackle 1989's The Package, starring Gene Hackman, as well as Tommy Lee Jones. No slouches there in the acting department.
No, it's a fun tradition that we started with Long Kiss Goodnight and On Her Majesty's came along, and we've got a list of some more Christmas spy films, and this is one of them. And speaking of The Package, a wonderfully wrapped Christmas package, it's a double bill next week because we also have an interview with the film's director, Mr. Andrew Davis. If that's a name you don't recognize, let me tell you one film title: The Fugitive.
Yep, and also actually Under Siege, which was another big hit.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful double bill and a wonderful Christmas present to all these spy movie fans out there. So, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to get some festive cheer and join us next week for 1989's Gene Hackman Christmas-themed spy film, The Package. If you like what you heard this week on the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, and do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, we'll take on the world and win.